I were to ask you, what is the PS2 best known for? You'd probably be able to give me a few answers. However, those answers are all most likely wrong, as there is only one true answer to that question. And that answer is edging. It's no secret that the 2000s was a strange time for games. I think with gaming and nerd culture being so intertwined, big companies felt a need to create a bit of a separation and thus open up the market a bit more by trying to make gaming quote-unquote cool. Shifting sharply towards edginess in every possible way, the 2000s was the definitive edgy era for gaming. It brought us a lot of wild stuff we never would have gotten if there wasn't such a large collaborative effort from all the big gaming companies to push this solution. Shadow the Hedgehog has his own game, but he also has a gun and says bad words because that's cool. Mario has a tribal tattoo. Devil May Cry was started on the PS2 and it has a distinctly edgy game. Crash Bandicoot has multiple tribal tattoos. Jak and Daxter also started on the PS2 and did a complete tonal 180 to have an edgy game. Zelda did a cute game and people got mad, so Nintendo made an edgy Zelda in response. There's edgy Pokemon game where you do stealing, which is a crime. The Game Boy has a tribal tattoo. You get what I mean. The aggressive attempt at edginess found in 2000s gaming was the majority of the landscape at the time. Some of it was clearly genuine, and some of the more corpo stuff is hilarious in retrospect, but I really do find a lot to enjoy from that era, and hell, a lot of the cool we were being fed back then is still cool in my opinion. I think about this era of edge frequently, and as somebody who's really into Final Fantasy, it's interesting to see the franchise's response to those expectations. Prior to this cultural shift, Final Fantasy was never not cool. Since Tetsuya Nomura moved up to character designer for the series, starting with 6, there has always been an undeniable coolness about Final Fantasy. Nomura's fashion-forward designs, coupled with his unique tastes, brought us some of the coolest looking characters ever made. The man can do it all, from high fantasy like his designs with 6, to the more grounded designs with exaggerated elements like with 7 onwards. Featuring logic-defying hair, borderline impractical but sick weapons, and unnecessary belts and accessories, the characters of Final Fantasy were unique in the realm of JRPGs at the time, and were another element that the series set a precedent for. During the Great Edgening, it felt like mainline Final Fantasy carried on with business as usual, continuing to tell mature stories, keeping up with its already cool character design while maintaining the series' signature silliness and levity that's always sprinkled throughout. Tidus is a fun, happy guy. Look at this guy and tell me he's dark and brooding. I mean, he doesn't even have a gun. To be fair, 10 came out in 2001, which was when this whole craze was only starting, but 12, which was 2006, also feels very much like classic Final Fantasy. It's a bit more mature, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily edgy. So around this time, you might think Square completely ignored what nearly everybody else was doing to keep doing their own brand of cool, but that's not entirely true. Okay, context. Squeenix was working on a project called the Compilation of Final Fantasy VII. It's a bunch of extra Final Fantasy VII content that further explores the story and characters through different forms of media. I have another video where I go over a few of the more obscure entries in the project, those being the OVA's Final Fantasy VII The Last Order, which served as a teaser for Crisis Core, and episode Denzel On the Way to a Smile, which focuses on the aftermath of Meteor Fall through the eyes of Denzel, leading up to when he meets Cloud and Tifa. Check that out if you want to hear me cover more from compilation. Maybe even compile that subscribe button. Anyways, the most famous pieces of compilation are obviously Crisis Core, which doesn't really fall under the edgy umbrella, and the Final Fantasy VII movie, Advent Children, which was made at the height of the edge craze, and in my opinion, does.
Our sins ever forgiven?
I've never tried.
You mean never tried?
Never tried.
You never tried?
Never.
At some point, I'd love to do a full video on Advent Children, as it's a pretty strange piece of 7, but for this video, all you need to know is that it's Final Fantasy VII at its edgiest. Washed out colors, dark narrative elements, i.e. geostigma, over-the-top child playing with action figures-esque fights, and what a lot of fans consider to be Cloud at his lowest point emotionally, quite possibly as not interested as we have ever seen our beloved boy. Obviously, Advent Children is not a game, but that doesn't mean Squeenix didn't continue to draw from the well of Edge. Directly following Advent Children, both in release and the timeline, Dirge of Cerberus is the last piece of the Final Fantasy VII puzzle. Starring the edgiest character found in Final Fantasy VII, our sparklingly pretty vampire king Vincent Valentine, and not featuring either turn-based gameplay or Crisis Core style action RPG gameplay, instead being an over-the-shoulder shooter. That's right, guns. Dirge of Cerberus is Square's certified PS2 edgy game. Dirge of Cerberus is the only Final Fantasy with this style of gameplay, and it's the furthest we get into the 7 timeline, so there was already plenty of intrigue there. But it also had relatively mixed reception when it came out, with plenty of changes being made between the Japanese release and everywhere else, and those changes weren't enough to fix the reaction to the game. So considering Vincent is one of my favorite characters from 7 and the release of the game as well as the edgy era are long behind us, I wanted to take another look at Dirge of Cerberus to see if it really is as iffy as everybody thought at the time, and also feel out how it manages to fit into the rest of Final Fantasy VII being a part of compilation. Of course, while getting to spend a bit more time in that edgy time frame that I love so much. Aesthetically, Dirge of Cerberus is an interesting case. The game doesn't directly retrace a lot of the steps taken in 7, mostly just adjacent areas, but it does feature a good amount of environment types from 7. For a game starring Vincent, this approach is bold. His design is so evocative that when we're working at this resolution instead of the PS1 Lego style, location selection is really important. Vincent is one of the more out there designs from 7, and placing him in the wrong setting could easily look silly. I'm happy to say that 99% of Dirge of Cerberus looks fantastic. When the game is working in gloom or the traditional 7 hyper-industrial aesthetics is when it looks its best. Running around streets dressed by heavy rainfall, tearing through the Shinra Manor, and exploring an old Mako reactor are settings where Dirge of Cerberus hits a pitch-perfect harmony. These environments strongly complement Vincent's design, and despite Dirge of Cerberus covering a lot of ground, I was left feeling it was very aesthetically homogeneous. There's a couple areas working with more environmental settings that, while not being out of place for Final Fantasy VII, don't really work with Vincent front and center, but it's basically like one chapter in the game where this is the case. It does look funny, but it's just that, funny. The grit you're looking for is still here. For the majority of the game, Dirge of Cerberus makes strong choices within the realm of 7 to communicate that this is Vincent's game, and leaving that impression is immeasurably important just on a conceptual level. Dirge of Cerberus keeps this trend going with the other visual elements. There's some really nice dressing here. I like Vincent's little cape flip he does in like every cutscene. We also have lots of unnecessary slow motion in cutscenes because hell yeah, brother. In-game HUD is entirely cool as can be, and exploring the world of 7 with the PS2's unique visuals is a treat. Considering Dirge of Cerberus came out before Crisis Core, this is the first time Gaia was realized in 3D for a video game, and it's very in line with how it looks today. Even though they had Advent Children to reference at this point, it's still very well done here. Just by the nature of the gameplay, it's nowhere near as freely explorable as Crisis Core, but it's cool to run around select signature locations as Vincent, especially ones where he fits right in. Dirge of Cerberus is the perfect example of the edgy era aesthetically. Cold color choices, gritty, dilapidated locations, and putting in the effort to make anything and everything as cool as it can be. It's a PS2-ass game, and I mean that in the best way possible. Moving away from more general vibes, I have to talk about character design. You're probably thinking, that's weird because this is a 7 spin-off. Everyone just looks like they did in Advent Children. And you're right. Established 7 characters all do look like lower poly versions of how they did in Advent Children, and that's all good with me. I love the Advent Children designs. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is because there's a few new characters in Dirge of Cerberus, and to be blunt, they look bad. Tetsuya Nomura was the character designer for Dirge of Cerberus, just like with every other 7 related media, but for some reason the new additions feel so out of place. Now calm down, this is not Kingdom Hearts slander. However, nearly every single new character in Dirge of Cerberus looks very much like a Kingdom Hearts character, and not like anything you'd expect from 7's established look. To be fair, around the time Dirge of Cerberus was cooking, Nomura was just coming off of Kingdom Hearts 2 and had already spearheaded 1, so I don't think it's crazy to say he let some of that influence bleed into Dirge of Cerberus. Most of the new characters look off, especially when they're side by side with original 7 designs. The more Kingdom Hearts style exaggerated proportions, fashion, and rounded features, as well as color choices, just don't work for me. They're distractingly not Final Fantasy VII. You could argue for some of them that there's lore reason as to why they look the way they do, but there was clearly a much better way to go about that than making them stick out like a sore thumb. If that was the intention behind their look, it's lazy. The off-character designs is an unnecessary blight on the vibe cohesion Dirge has going on, and this misstep is especially confusing considering Nomura himself did it, and this problem didn't exist in Advent Children with new characters at all. To the man's credit though, there are some new characters that look fine, but the bad ones outweigh the inoffensive ones. These new characters just look wrong. It bothered me. I don't know if it's just a me thing here, but I didn't like them. Please leave me an essay in the comments telling me that I'm wrong and should get hit by a truck. Something I wasn't expecting from revisiting Dirge of Cerberus is how great the soundtrack is. The soundtrack easily takes the game's unique identity to the next level. As far as I can tell, there are very few reused 7 compositions or motifs incorporated into the soundtrack. It's mostly original, and it's brilliant. The soundtrack complements Vincent's POV perfectly and elevates every location Dirge of Cerberus utilizes. We have sweeping orchestral tracks, more ambient stuff, Crisis Core-style distorted guitar pieces, and espionage Metal Gear type beats. It encompasses every style 7 has utilized before, while remaining in the style of, and also trying new things, with those more Metal Gear tracks being very suited to Vincent as a character, as well as the gameplay. Dirge popped off with its music. Just like with the environments, it's varied, but it works perfectly for what Square was going for here. Some people might view the lack of original 7 comps as a missed opportunity, but I don't think so at all. Combining the score with Dirge of Cerberus's aesthetic is what makes it undeniably Vincent's own game. It's edgy, and it's out there, yet it's clearly identifiable as 7. Also, we have Gact. That's right, they got King Genesis in for this one to compose a few songs, and they're solid J-rock tracks. Nothing crazy unique for Gact as an artist, but they're very complementary to the edge and drama of Dirge. They feel like a necessary inclusion. His collaboration with Square for Dirge is what created Genesis and led to his character being fleshed out in Crisis Core, so it's interesting as a fan to see the beginnings of that relationship. Even if you don't plan on playing Dirge, I recommend giving the soundtrack a listen. It's one of my favorite elements from this game. The music is exactly what I wanted from Dirge of Cerberus. This OST working in tandem with the game's fully realized aesthetic is just magic. Even on its own, take away all the swag, it's still stellar. A killer soundtrack is expected from Final Fantasy, and even though this is a spin-off and not composed by Nobuo Uematsu, it delivers. Masashi Hamauzu nailed what I think any fan of 7 would imagine scoring a Vincent story, and the madman did it without leaning on existing compositions. That statement is wild, but it's true. Like with every other project in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, the primary reason a fan would want to play Dirge of Cerberus is for the story. The main appeal of the game, even now, is that it's the furthest we get into the 7 timeline. We're not at the gameplay section of the video yet, but I'm sure you know it's very different for a Final Fantasy game. So different that it's fair to say Dirge is not a game the average 7 enjoyer would seek out. Most people that play it are there for the story, and there's plenty of directions to take it considering where we left off. There's also the opportunity to explore and get into what Vincent is all about. In the original, he's an optional party member with plenty of mystique surrounding him, not necessarily in backstory, but in him as a character. So it's only natural that Dirge of Cerberus would focus heavily on those 2 paths. Here's the thing though, it doesn't really go as far as you'd expect in either department. Dirge takes place around a year after Advent Children. Reeve is doing the whole World Regenesis Organization stuff. For anybody unfamiliar, the WRO is basically working towards fixing up the planet and dealing with any remnants of Shinra that flare up. One of those pesky Shinra flare-ups happen when an old Shinra experiment known as Deep Ground is unearthed. Deep Ground is essentially a bunch of people Shinra trapped underground to put through intense training in soldier genetic experimentation. So these silly folks get out and start killing as many people as possible in an attempt to summon the weapon Omega, who will destroy what remains of Gaia because revenge, obviously. So Reeve hits up Vincent on WhatsApp and is like, "Hey man, can you help us with this?" And Vincent is like,
Deep ground.
and you're off to save the world. That's the main setup for Dirge. It's pretty straightforward. There's world-ending threat. You gotta stop the threat, man. I don't know if spoilers matter that much for this because everything is fairly inconsequential in this game, and also, like, any fan of 7 that cares would have played it by now. I'm not going to do a whole summary, of course, but I'll go over some of it. The reason I say everything is pretty inconsequential in Dirge is for a few reasons. By the end of the game, Gaia, as well as almost all the characters, are effectively back to where everything was by the end of Advent Children. The world is still ruined and back to being in recovery. That hasn't changed. And 90% of what we learn about Vincent is stuff we already knew. There's a couple big moments, like Hojo being behind Deep Ground the entire time and uploading his brain into a computer or whatever to bring himself back to life through Vice, the big bad of Dirge, but that's quickly undone, so again, it doesn't end up meaning anything, and honestly that's okay because it's dumb. I will say the whole concept of Deep Ground is interesting and fits with Hojo/Shinra stuff you'd expect, but the characters attached to it, like Vice, Nero, Shulk, Azul, and Rosso, just aren't very interesting. There's almost 4 hours of just cutscenes, and after everything, I didn't care all that much for any of the new characters. So by the end of the game, we're back where we were by the end of Advent Children. There's just some new guys hanging around, and Vincent got to be a true hero, sacrificing himself, but of course, not really sacrificing himself, to save the world. That's it. Yeah, there's bits of new stuff about Vincent, like they get somewhat further into his chaos gene, but nothing incredibly significant, and the flashbacks with him just don't go as far as they should. A good portion of them are what we got in the original 7, but played out at length instead of vague posting. However, there's not any crazy developments that come from that. We get Vincent Dad reveal, who worked with Lucrezia on researching Chaos and Omega, and then the man dies. We don't get to know him, or Lucrezia, or Hojo, or even Turk Vincent as people much at all. Lucrezia rejecting Vincent because she feels responsible for his dad's death is new, but it's there to explain something that really didn't need a reason. The bullet points hit in the original game are what actually matters out of anything we're shown. Nothing recontextualizes the big picture. I'll put it this way. If they released an FF7 game that took place after Dirge, there's a pretty good chance you wouldn't have to play it to understand what's happening, but you would most likely have to have seen Advent Children, which covers far more ground in comparison. To be honest, the biggest thing I got out of Dirge, story-wise, is the 2 minutes of screen time the original crew have. Cloud is evidently much happier than in Advent Children, and even though there's not much of him here, I was really hyped to see that detail.
I don't think we have to worry, though. Those two should be fine.
Yeah, and what about you?
What do you think?
I'm not sure if there was a bit of hesitancy to touch the main crew because maybe Square wasn't sure if they wanted to do more with them later at the time, but I'm actually pretty okay with their lack of importance. I was really excited to see them briefly, but it's good that their time was kept short. I think if Cloud was featured heavily, then it would detract a bit from Vincent's spotlight. I'm sure some people were upset about this, but to me it makes sense. Something that I thought was pretty cool was giving the less important party members bigger roles for Dirge. Reeve/Kachi are here, and Yuffie is also around. Something else I should note quickly is that Dirge has extra missions you can play through that originally had story content attached to them, but the story bits were cut from releases outside of Japan. Between the game releasing there and everywhere else, Square saw the reaction to it and tried to make a bunch of small changes to compensate for the negativity surrounding the game, and I guess somewhere along the line that extra story was cut to leave room for other changes. Who knows? Maybe if it was here and I played through them, I would have had a more positive experience with the story, but for now, it is what it is. The story we ended up with is definitely a miss, though. It's very surface level despite being so long. It's a bit silly.
Constructed. Business. Proto. Materia. Awake. Lucrezia's. Experiments. Synaptic net dive.
Psychomantis.
The new characters are boring, there's little to no consequences, and it doesn't deliver on meaningfully expanding the overall 7 story or its characters. Which is not only what most 7 fans would play the game for in the first place, but it also blatantly contradicts the intention of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. To end this section on a positive note, I really appreciated the performances. It's the Advent Children cast, and they'll always be my favorite voices for these characters. Steve Bloom got an opportunity to actually show off his Vincent, and it's perfect. He's too cool, beautifully nonchalant, and brings the emotion when it's called for. The only weird thing I noticed with the dub is that it seems almost everyone pronounces Shinra differently. We got Shinra, Shinra, and Shinra all in here, and I have no idea why. But aside from that, it's great to see the Advent Children cast get another shot at their characters. The distinct personalities they all bring to the table helps a lot with the lackluster writing. The biggest issue everybody has with Dirge is the gameplay. It's a style of game that I think most fans of Final Fantasy wouldn't usually play, and it's definitely an unexpected approach for the series in general. I think those two factors heavily set in stone the reputation that Dirge has, and maybe it's crazy to say, but in my opinion, Dirge isn't bad at all. It's actually kind of fun. Is it mind-blowing and super refined? No, but it became clear to me pretty quickly that people are way too mean about it. My memory of Dirge of Cerberus before I played it again for this video is very close to what everybody says online. It's horribly unintuitive, janky, and all around not fun. However, I've since developed a habit of going through every menu on a game title screen before I play the game, and Dirge has a tutorial sitting right there on the very first screen, which I definitely ignored the first time I played it. This time I played the tutorial before I actually started the game, and I'm not saying it magically makes Dirge peak or anything, but it certainly explains a lot that the in-game tutorials don't. Without playing the tutorial, yes, it is horribly unintuitive, but after going through it and getting into the game after, my experience was much better. The gun mechanics are pretty fun. You have 3 different gun types, only 2 are useful, that you can buff with accessories and upgrade. Getting your stats up, making situation-sensitive builds, and infusing your bullets with elemental materia for MP helps it feel more in line with its Final Fantasy JRPG roots. The actual shooting is fine, albeit aiming is a bit sensitive. There's a chain mechanic where if you can hit consistent shots without getting hit yourself, then number go up and you deal more damage per shot. It's pretty hard to die in the game, so I think the chain mechanic is what really helps keep you engaged as a player. Once your chain is up, it's really satisfying to take out soldiers in one shot, and if you play really well, you get a good rank on missions, which will get you more gil and XP to spend on upgrades. Outside of gun, there's a basic 3-hit combo Vincent can do. You'll rarely use it, it's very stiff, and the damage isn't great. You can also go beast mode in certain situations, but it also sucks. It's very clunky and slow. I only ever used it to get a free heal. Dirge works with a chapter system for its structure. You're dropped in an area after a minimum 5 minutes of cutscenes, and then you're given objectives on the way to your linear endpoint to the mission. You go through the area gunning down dudes, and sometimes you're given a sub-objective or 2 along the way for extra XP and rewards. 13 enjoyers, get ready, because if you're looking for hallways, Dirge has them. The level design is built off of hallways filled with various types of enemies, and in the context of the genre, it was the right way to go. It makes sense for a shooter to funnel the player through a tighter space with obstacles in the way for them to overcome. If you want to get a good rank, then you need to keep your accuracy and speed up while you rip through the various twists and turns of any given level. Plenty of times you'll exit a hallway to a bigger room with enemies placed in a more shooting gallery fashion, which also makes sense to include and gets the player to switch modes mentally, quickly adapting to the new unexpected space. The linearity works really well for this type of game. Dirge uses the point A to point B mission structure and lack of exploration or alternative pathing to create lots of set pieces and unique scenarios to do your shooting in, which keeps the gameplay variety strong despite seemingly limited mechanics. There's also boss fights here and there, and they're all not good. All of them have some level of jank going on. Some just don't flow properly, some are way too tanky, but they're all certainly not fun. I know it's a Final Fantasy and there has to be over-the-top boss fights, but really enemy hordes would have worked a lot better here. Fighting a single target in a shooter game for a prolonged period of time just feels wrong. Anytime I was in a boss fight, I would spam all my materia shots or any other powerful items to get through them as quickly as possible because playing them normally felt like a complete chore. There's another small issue that pops up near the end of the game where certain enemies are just immune to normal bullets. You run out of MP pretty fast, which is your only ranged option for dealing with them, so you're essentially forced to engage with the hand-to-hand combat, which, as I mentioned earlier, blows. There's a good few second gap between the 3-hit combo Vincent can do, so you're just taking lots of unnecessary damage in these encounters, and the pace of the game takes a nosedive when you run into them. Overall though, Dirge is fun to play once you get the hang of it. hot swapping guns to deal with different scenarios, getting your chain up to rip through encounters, coming to a clearing and long range picking off enemies. It's all very satisfying. Dirge isn't very hard, you're probably not gonna die a lot, and it keeps a good pace throughout missions, so it all adds together to be good, dumb fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. Vincent is a powerful, strongly capable character, and for the majority of the game, Dirge empowers you as the player to show that off. Don't get me wrong. Dirge of Cerberus is not some Final Fantasy hidden gem or cult 10 out of 10 that people dismissed back when it came out, but looking at it today with an open mind, it's certainly not a bad game by any means. I personally think it's a great time despite its issues. Again, it's not a stretch to say that the game's reputation likely comes from just how different it is compared to 7. Most people that are into Final Fantasy VII enough to bother with the spin-off probably aren't the same crowd that would seek out games similar to Dirge, let alone the average Final Fantasy fan who probably also has next to no interest in an action shooter. Combine that subversion of expectations with the absence of a meaningful story, confusing at first controls, and well, yeah, it makes sense that it wasn't a hit with most people. For me, I was able to simply enjoy the game for what it is, even though I would also never play something like that if it wasn't for the Final Fantasy branding. I wanted the edge, and Dirge gave it to me in spades. I was looking for a moody atmosphere, and it was there from the moment I booted it up. I wanted to see one of my favorite characters from 7 get a chance to show off how damn cool he is, and I was not disappointed. Importantly, I also wanted to have fun, and I'd be lying to say I didn't have lots. Yes, it's inconsequential in the grand scheme of Final Fantasy VII, to the point where it doesn't even need to exist, and it's also undeniably rough around the edges. But once the charm got me, none of that mattered. Dirge took me right back to when nearly every game had to be as cool as possible, and after taking a second look, it might be one of the coolest to ever do it. The world of Final Fantasy VII wielding the power of the lost art of edgy PS2 game is something to behold. I had all the same feelings I get when playing through games like Resi 4 or early DMC. It has that exact same kind of swag. Maybe if the team had a little more experience within the genre and the writing got a much needed boost, then it would be a certified banger through and through. But regardless, she is very gorgeous to me. Like seriously, I get it. I get why people talk about Dirge the way they do. Check any forum where somebody asks if they should play it, and the comments are all telling them to just watch a plot summary video. Which is funny because like, dude, for what? But I'm not just hyping it up because it's 7 related. Dirge is truly and honestly so vibey and genuinely fun once you get past its numerous shortcomings. If it wasn't a Final Fantasy VII spin-off but kept the same energy and gameplay, I'd still like it. I can admit it happens to be really appealing to me specifically for a lot of reasons, but even considering that, I think fans should give it another shot. If people went in with realistic expectations and open minds, I could see the general opinion on the game changing to be more on the positive side in retrospect. I gave it a second chance after all these years, and what can I say? Dirge of Cerberus has earned a special place in my heart, and I believe it should be praised for being one of the most PS2-ass PS2 Edge games to be released on the PS2. Hey, thanks for watching the video on Sexy Vampire. If you enjoyed it and want to see more videos from me, feel free to shoot the subscribe button with a gun. Also, I already have the next video planned, but if you have an idea for me, please leave a comment, they're so helpful. If you want even more updates on Mr. Ghoul, I'm at GhoulFMV on both Twitter and Blue Sky. To the Ghoul enjoyers, I'm very sorry this video is late. I was gone for almost 3 weeks last month, and despite getting a lot of work done on this video before I left, I came back to some very fun health issues that ate up the rest of the month. I should be alright, so we're getting back on track this month. I'll post another new video to make up for the gap. See you again soon, and as always, love ya.